Our first witness this morning is a longtime friend of mine and of many people in this room, David Barton, an historian and a collector of artifacts from American history. And we've asked him to come in and kind of lay down the base point of where this country has been with religious liberty in the military. David Barton, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Governor. Secretary Carson, good to be with the commissioners. My name is David Barton. I help operate 2 world-class museums here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We have more than 100,000 items ranging from the time of Columbus up through the Apollo programs, and much of our collection relates to military history. In recent years, there have been unprecedented attacks against traditional religious practices in the military. As a result of this increasing hostility toward public religious expressions, there's been much confusion over what is and is not constitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court has sought to mitigate this hostility and this confusion by pointing to what is now called the history and tradition test. The court explained, quote, "Longstanding, religiously expressive monuments, symbols, and practices require a strong presumption of constitutionality." I'll use my time to present a brief historical overview of several longstanding military religious practices that are relevant to this hearing. I'll also show you original military items from across the centuries, which will be available for your perusal on the breaks. To begin with, the American military was established by Congress in 1775 with George Washington placed at its head. In his first general order, George Washington informed the soldiers that, quote, he forbid profane cursing, swearing, and drunkenness, and that, quote, "all officers and soldiers not engaged on actual duty are to be in punctual attendance on divine service." Throughout the war, Washington issued many other orders infusing religious activities directly into military life. About the time the British surrendered in 1781, Congress approved the production of the first English language Bible printed in America. It came off the presses in 1782, and this is it. It's one of the rarest books in the world. Chaplain John Rogers asked George Washington to give one of these to each soldier in the Revolution, and Washington stated that he was, quote, "well pleased to do so," except that he'd already sent the troops home. So providing Bibles to troops did become a long-standing practice in the military. In 1816, a number of our founding fathers, signers of the Constitution, got together and started the American Bible Society. This is the first Bible they produced, and this is the first military Bible. It went to sailors on the USS John Adams. Moving to the Civil War, this is one of President Abraham Lincoln's orders to the military. This general order requires that, quote, "the orderly observance of the Sabbath by the officers and men in the military and naval service." He ended the order with these words. He said, "the first general order issued by the father of his country, George Washington, after the Declaration of Independence indicates the spirit in which our institutions were founded and should ever be defended." Quoting from Washington, quote, "the general hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country." That's Abraham Lincoln's order that he gave in 1863. During the Civil War, some 4 million Bibles were distributed. Here was one for Union soldiers, here's one for Confederate soldiers. And in World War II, more than 6 million Bibles were distributed. On the inside cover of the World War I Bibles was a message from President Teddy Roosevelt, or a message from President Woodrow Wilson, or a message from from Six-Star General John J. Pershing. That was on the inside of those Bibles. In World War II, millions of Bibles and New Testaments were distributed. These with a brown cover were for the Army, and these with the sea blue cover were for the Navy. Inside, both had a message from President Franklin Roosevelt about the importance of the Bible. Across from his message in both Bibles is the Christian naval pennant flying. You see a picture of it right below you there. This pennant flew above the American flag. And for those accustomed to today's aggressively secular public square, flying a Christian pennant above the flag might be shocking. But even today, the U.S. flag code still places the naval call for divine service above the American flag. Also distributed in that war was this steel cover New Testament, bearing the inscription, "May this keep you safe from harm." Known as a Heart Shield Bible, when placed in the left breast pocket over the heart, it could stop a bullet. Multiple veterans, of whom I've specifically spoken to two, acknowledged that this Bible saved their lives during the war. One of the most momentous events in World War II was the D-Day invasion. This top-secret operation was announced to the nation in an FDR fireside chat, at which time the president personally led the nation in a 6-minute prayer, a prayer prayed while the troops were landing on D-Day. That prayer was published and rebroadcast worldwide in 28 different languages, and it's called perhaps the greatest mass prayer in all history. President Roosevelt's D-Day prayer was made into the official White House gift for 1944, which you can see framed on the right end of the displays at the end. After D-Day came the Battle of the Bulge. General Dwight Eisenhower placed General George Patton in charge. Patton informed Colonel James O'Neill that he wanted all 250,000 men in his famous Third Army to begin praying, because without God's direct intervention, they would not prevail against the Nazis in that battle. The result was this. This is a prayer card signed by George Patton, distributed to every one of his 250,000 soldiers. They prayed. Patton also prayed. There's a painting of Patton praying that was printed at the end of the war that you can see on the table. And Patton and numerous of his officers openly reported that this prayer is what turned the tide in the Battle of the Bulge. Colonel James O'Neill was actually awarded a Bronze Star for writing this prayer that God answered. Significantly, World War II Bibles included messages from leaders such as 5-star General George C. Marshall, 4-star General Douglas MacArthur, 4-star General Omar Bradley, and 4-star General Mark Clark. Can you imagine what would happen today if a 4-, 5-, or 6-star general were to urge troops to read the scriptures, or if a commander such as Patton issued a prayer card and asked his troops to pray, or if a commander such as George Washington strongly urged his troops to attend divine services? Yet this is completely acceptable military practice for decades, generations, and even centuries until recent years. There's much more that could be covered, but our history is clear. There simply was no widespread historical precedent for opposing or limiting biblical beliefs or expression in the military until the administrations of President Barack Obama and then President Joe Biden. Both implemented numerous policies attacking and restricting religious faith in the military. Here are just a few. In January 2010, tiny coded Bible verse references that appeared for decades in the serial numbers of popular military scopes and gun sights were required to be removed. Troops were directed to scratch off and paint over Bible verse references. August 2011, the Air Force stopped teaching just war theory to officers in California because the course was taught by chaplains and because it was based on a Bible perspective introduced by St. Augustine in the 3rd century. For centuries, just war theory was taught in civilized nations across the world, including America, until Obama's action. In September 2011, the Air Force Chief of Staff prohibited commanders from notifying airmen of programs and services available to them if they came from chaplains. The Air Force ordered, in February 2012, the Air Force ordered the removal of the word God from the patch of the Rapid Capabilities Office. In June 2012, the Obama administration revoked the longstanding U.S. policy of allowing service emblems to be placed on military Bibles, which had been a popular practice among all of the branches. There's many other similar incidents, and sadly, that hostility was repeated in the Biden administration. Here's a couple of examples. In September 2021, the Biden administration rejected First Amendment religious exemptions for military personnel. Of 24,000 religious objections filed against the COVID vaccine, only 4 were allowed. And then April 2023, on Easter weekend, the Biden administration sent a cease and desist letter to Catholic priests ordering that they stop providing pastoral care at Walter Reed Military Hospital. There are many other examples, and you can imagine how presidents ranging from George Washington to Woodrow Wilson and from Franklin Roosevelt to George W. Bush would have rejected the current atmosphere. Decades and even centuries of military history stand in direct opposition to the religious hostility introduced in the military in recent years. Governor.
Thank you, David. When he first shared those facts with me, it was shocking. And the question, David, I'll ask the first, and when I see your red lights, I can call on the other members. How did this go on for 8 years during the Obama administration and 4 years under the Biden administration? how did this go on? I would say quietly. I think a lot of people in this room are hearing this for the first time. Uh, where were people standing up, or were they too afraid of the military?
There were people standing up, but this got very little publicity. You would find these kind of events because I would see them in legal filings or someone trying to defend them, but not because it got much active news coverage, because America in many areas, as we see from education through politics, through military, has become very secular and very intolerant of religious expression of others. And so that was exacerbated, I think, in those particular 12 years. At least they were elevated to a degree we've never seen before in the way of the legal action against soldiers, officers, and others. So part of it was the fact that the public didn't know really it was going on. And another part was the fact that at that point in time, there was a lot of confusion in the courts about what could and could not be done religiously. We had a fairly hostile set of federal courts at that time. I think in the last 6 years, the Supreme Court has sent us in a very different direction through that history and tradition test. By reintroducing that history and tradition test, we're back to what we could do before.
Members of the committee, questions, comments? Dr. Carson?
Yeah, David, good to see you.
You too, sir.
How did people avoid the Establishment Clause when George Washington was telling the troops that they should attend services?
You know, it's interesting. The Establishment Clause, I think one of the best explanations of the Establishment Clause was actually given by Thomas Jefferson in his famous Separation Church and State letter. 233-word letter, and people quote 8 words from it, a wall of separation between church and state. And it was Jefferson that explained that the Establishment Clause, the wall of separation, kept the government from establishing a single national denominational religion as had been done in Europe, where the government says you're all going to be Catholics or Anglicans or Lutherans or separatists or whatever, but the government had no problem with any type of religious expression that was not coercive. And so the fact that Washington issued orders might be considered coercive, but it was not trying to establish a single national denomination. And that's how they got around it, because their understanding of separation church and state is very different from ours. I'll point out that earlier courts, when they used Jefferson's phrase on separation, they actually quoted all of the letter, as in 1878 Reynolds versus U.S. And starting in 1947, the courts no longer quoted Jefferson's full letter. They only quoted 8 words, the 8 words we hear today, a wall of separation between church and state. When you read the whole letter and you see all that they did before, they were only after not having in America what they had in Europe, and that is the government telling you what religion you will be and then punishing you if you don't do what they say.
Rabbi Soloveitchik? You're good.
Great. Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to add, I thought it would be a relevant historical note, because I'm so interested in so many of the stories that you cited, and particularly obsessed with the tale of the Patton Prayer, that in my own research regarding it, I chanced upon a website that's dedicated to the 134th Infantry Regiment, and they have there one image of the Patton Prayer card that was distributed. I think, as you mentioned, there was hundreds of thousands of cards distributed. And this one is unique because it was sent home by a Jewish service member of the Third Army to his parents. His name is Stanley Speiler, and he was writing to his clearly immigrant parents, telling them the whole story, that there was terrible weather during the Battle of the Bulge, and that they all prayed together. And then he wrote, in a mix of sort of English and Yiddish, explaining to his immigrant parents, he wrote, "And then the rain stopped." And then he signed it, "Your son Stanley, who was part of the Third Army." And you see, as both an American and a Jew, how proud he was, of course, to be serving and fighting for freedom, but of course, to take part in this prayer. Thank you.
That is an awesome account. And if I may add a historical note that might be enjoyed by all, George Washington's inauguration included 7 religious activities, and those activities were put together by a group of rabbis and Christian ministers. And so it was rabbis and Christian ministers that Washington had at the very beginning put together the religious activities in his administration.
Bishop Barron?
Yeah, thank you. I thought the presentation was really interesting and eye-opening. To me, the most surprising thing was certain prohibitions against the teaching of the just war theory because it's being proposed by a chaplain. It strikes me as an extremely helpful way to provide a framework for these issues. And also, as developed by Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and others, it's not a very sectarian approach. It's a very philosophical, reason-based approach. Just surprised by that and wondering how widespread that prohibition might be.
That's a good question. It was clamped down on certainly at that point in time. I have not seen anything to reverse that, but I cannot imagine that those who teach in our military academies would not be referring to just war, because it has been so long part of what we've done, helping soldiers even understand that killing can be justified and all the things that go with the psychological side of that. So, Bishop, I don't know the answer to that specifically. I just can't imagine that it's not there to some degree, although I do know that particularly in the Obama administration, they made radical changes in the service academies and the instructors. There was a time when they cleaned out military instructors and put in civilian instructors in military academies, which is not a great idea. So it may be gone. I cannot speak to that, but that is a great concern. To answer your first question, read the card, if I may give a bit of background. We had air superiority. Our tanks were not nearly as good as the German tanks. And our air superiority, particularly P-47s, P-51s, allowed our air to knock out the German tanks. But if we got in a tank-to-tank battle, we were in trouble. And Patton had 6 weeks of rain where he could not get planes off the ground. And so his casualties were extremely high. And at that point in time, he called in Colonel James O'Neill. And O'Neill wrote this down. He said that when he came in, Patton was looking out the window at all the rain coming down, had his arms behind his back, and said, "Colonel, do our men pray?" And Colonel said, "Well, of course, we have chaplains." I didn't ask if the chaplains prayed. I asked if the men prayed. He said, "Well, there's no atheists in foxholes. Sure they pray." He said, "That's not what I'm asking." He said, "I want to know if our men are praying about this weather right now. This weather needs to change." And he said, "Do you have any prayers on weather?" And Colonel O'Neill said, "I don't know. I'll check the prayer books and let you know." And he checked the prayer books, came back, said, "Don't have a prayer on weather." He said, "Well, I'll write you one." And so Patton said, "I want every one of the soldiers praying. We have to change this weather." And so this was the result. This is how Battle of the Bulge is how they spent Christmas of 1944. So on the other side, it has a Christmas holly down the side. It has a Christmas greeting signed by Patton. So this is how they spent Christmas. But here's the prayer they prayed. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we've had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who will call upon Thee, that armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish Thy justice among men and nations. Amen." That's the Patton prayer. The second question you had?
Why do you think that people weren't fighting against it like we would see today?
What we see in the 1960s is the Supreme Court takes a radically different direction and says no more voluntary prayer and Bible in schools. People think that was coerced. The Supreme Court specifically said that neither the fact that prayer is voluntarily participated in nor the fact that it's denominationally neutral serves to free it from constitutional defects that prayer in schools violates separation of church and state. So the court acknowledged it was a voluntary prayer, it was a non-denominational prayer, and they just said, we're not having any of that anymore. And so that introduction of hostility in 62, 63 is what has really spun up to where the intolerance today is such that people cannot tolerate any presence of activity or even of a religious person often in a setting. And that's what hopefully the court is starting to turn back, try to take back. But it's gone decades of us having educated in an ardently secular manner with intolerance toward any type of religious expression.
Kelly Scheck.
David, I think you know this, but our charter is for us to give specific recommendations to the president. And I'm thinking of the Military Chaplains Act, which is going through right now. That might be one type of thing that would protect our chaplains. But I'm just wondering, do you have any recommendations of what we could ask the president to do? And if you don't, even if you would send them in later, we'd like to have them. But I'd love to know if you have any right now that you have on your mind.
I would say, Kelly, when this was happening with the Obama administration, for 4 years, I kept a list of every activity actually again. And then I got tired after 4 years because I had pages and pages of those things that had been done, and it was still going. Part of it, I'd say, a great thing to do would be to repeal a lot of the stuff that was done then. Put military emblems back on Bibles if soldiers want them. Put the scripture back into the serial numbers of scopes, the Trigicon scopes that are so popular. Allow just war theory to be taught in all the academies. All the things that were done, check to see if they're still being followed in the way that was introduced by that administration back then, and reverse much of that. But getting back to having chaplains, and there was a period of time in the Obama administration, I talked to a number of chaplains. Obama administration was actually looking at outsourcing chaplains. They were going to make them no longer part of the units, but they were going to outsource them as contract people that could be wherever they need. So they were no longer going to be embedded with the troops. That kind of hostility drove the chaplains back from the aggressive teaching positions that they had for a long time. And so they're still in, but even today, they no longer teach and instruct in the way that they used to even 10 to 12 years ago. There's not the boldness on the chaplain staff because of that. So I would say that many of those things that were done at that period of time, including what was done in the Biden administration as well, the Obama administration, take that as a checklist and make sure all that's turned around. Put the word God back on the Rapid Capabilities Office patch. No reason not to have, if God, in God we trust is our motto, why can't we have that on a patch?
Any other questions for David? I will tell you that when you sent me that long list, I did have a discussion with the president. He's aware of all of this, and I would anticipate our president moving forward. Don't want to speak for him, of course, but this was eye-opening, I think, to his staff and everyone else. Would it be fair to say that the government, at their expense, provided all of these Bibles from 1775 until 2012?
There was actually 3 ways that Bibles were provided. Sometimes they were printed with congressional endorsement, as this one was. Sometimes they were printed by an outside group and given to the soldiers with full blessing of the military. Other times, down on the table, you'll see Bibles that are printed by the government printing office. Jewish, Roman Catholic, Christian, or Protestant scriptures there. So there's 3 ways that historically we've seen it happen, but the government's always been supportive of and partnering with, sometimes actually bearing the cost of it. So whether it's a shared kind of a partnership or the government doing it or just allowing others to facilitate it, all 3 of those have been used in our history.
So that all came to an end basically in 2012.
The hostility that was introduced in actually 2009 is when it started. The emblems came off the Bibles in 2012, but 2009 is when we saw a dramatic change in the role of chaplains, and particularly the Air Force. The Air Force was beat down more than any of the other branches. What happened at the Air Force Academy and other places was just unthinkable compared to what they had been previously. So they've not recovered all the way from that. There's been a lot of timidness and fear of lawsuits, others that have kind of driven people back. And so the ability to come back in a more bold way, even as we'd been maybe 15 to 18 years ago, would be a dramatic change in military. But certainly what happened starting in 2009 with Bibles, encouraging that again. And I was talking to a chaplain just this past week. He said his 5 deployments, he was the chief of chaplains on the force that was sent out. His 5 deployments, they did not have enough Bibles. They were not able to get enough Bibles. Soldiers wanted Bibles, and they were just not able to get their hands on them because of that kind of limitation that's come.
Well, as Kelly said, we'll be making our recommendations to the president as our charter commands. And this has been tremendous testimony. Thank you for sharing your history with us, and thank you for preserving history with your 100,000. Harlan, I thought you had a lot of historic items in your home and in your businesses, but that's quite a collection. So, David, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Governor.
Yes, sir.